Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guests Suzy Buchanan and SidMarie Arroyo, both of whom are associated with the Shirley-Eustis House located in Roxbury. Suzy serves as the executive director, and SidMarie is a highly accomplished artist. They're here today to inform us about a fascinating undertaking that led to the recent installation of memorial stones for 8 enslaved people who worked at the Shirley-Eustis House under Colonial Governor William Shirley. During the program, we'll find out why and how the project came about, and in the process, we'll come to better understand and appreciate who these 8 slaves were and some of the history and current mission of the Shirley-Eustis House, which is one of the few confirmed sites in the city where enslaved people worked and lived. Let's start by meeting our guests and then learning all about the painted stones memorialization and their association with the history of slavery at the Shirley-Eustis House, which was declared a U.S. National Historic Landmark in 1960. Welcome. So delighted you're both able to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
As you know, Suzy, I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the Shirley-Eustis House a couple of weeks ago, learned a little bit about the history, got to see the stones on the grounds, eager to hear more and inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if each of you would very briefly just share a little bit more about your background, professional interests, current positions. Suzy, would you please start?
Sure. So I started as executive director here at the Shirley-Eustis House in the summer of 2019. And prior to that, I had worked at the Historic New England for a little while and ran the Hingham Historical Society for several years. And that's sort of my background is historic museum administration. Yeah, and I have to say this is, in a long career of working in places in Cleveland and Boston and Midwest, this is my favorite. This house has so much to tell and so much to tell that's relevant about our modern history and the contradictions we live with today that it's my favorite of my entire career so far.
I know we look forward to hearing a little snippet of that shortly. SidMarie, welcome. Would you please share a little bit about your background, please, and current interest?
Sure. So I come from a Puerto Rican single mom, born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. I went to UMass Boston. I graduated in 2013 and studied the history of the African diaspora and Latino studies. And while I was in my undergrad, I was aiming to become a history teacher, but I took an elective art course and I learned a little bit about painting. And I just kind of continued to paint on the side. But my career was in youth work. I did youth work for over 14 years. And I just recently just had the desire to pursue art more. So last year, December, I left my position at a youth organization right down the street from the Shirley House. And I've been just here in the small studio in Brockton, just pursuing a new path in art.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, eager to hear your thinking and what background went into the stones that we're going to appreciate shortly. Suzy, before we move right to the project and the really fascinating history and undertaking that went into it, would you please share just a little bit about the history of the site and how it's evolved today and what your current mission is, please?
Right. So, well, the house was built in the 1740s. I don't know if you want me to go back that far, but by His Excellency, the Royal Governor William Shirley of the province. He builds this sort of big, grand country mansion in a neighborhood sort of that had several of these mansions in the 1700s, where wealthy sort of folks would escape the heat and germs and smells of Boston proper in the summer in those days for the fresh air of the countryside. And Shirley's house was actually sort of it's the only one that survives today in Roxbury. And it was in its day really the biggest and the grandest of them. And we understand that sort of desire for him to make a statement because he's the royal governor at the time, right? And he really wants to sort of, showcase the might and the, power of the British Empire by channeling essentially the architecture of the Roman Empire in that age. And of course, if you're going to build an empire like Britain and France and Holland and Spain are trying to do in those days, who are you going to imitate but the Roman Empire, right? So he builds this big Palladian mansion that is later occupied. It's really occupied by sort of wealthy families through the 19th century or the early 19th century until it's finally occupied by the widow of a later governor to live in the house, Shirley-Eustis. And she's interesting because she spends the longest amount of time in the house. And during the 1860s, while her, wealthy neighbors who still have country estates in Roxbury begin to move away because Roxbury starts to see an influx of, factories and urban residents and recent immigrants. She doesn't have the money to do it. And so the house remains this kind of lonely estate until she dies in the 1860s. Then it gets used as a boarding house for a while, and then it becomes a tenement until finally in 1910 or 11, the city plans to destroy the house because they condemn the house and they're going to tear it down. And that's when a group of local Roxbury residents got together and sort of decided that that couldn't happen because of the house's history. And they bought the house and formed the Shirley-Eustis House Association. So we're, a little over 100 years old now. They formed it in 1913. And ever since then, it's been a site of sort of, memorialization, but also education and, museum and preservation, right, as that has evolved over the centuries. And then when I
Wonderful.
arrived, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that helps set the context because we want to make sure we have enough time to hear about terrific project that led to the memorialization, the 4244 Shirley Street project, really based across the street from the house.
Right. So right after I arrived here in 2019, this house, which we did not own at the time, was purchased by a developer. And it was going to be torn down and replaced with a 14-unit apartment building. And the neighborhood wasn't happy about that. And, one of my board members mentioned that the house was actually very old and was somehow associated with the Shirley-Eustis House because it had 18th century framing inside. And I had just been reading reports, sort of early investigations about the enslaved people at Shirley Place. And at that point, we really only knew about 2 of them. And, my first thought was, oh, could this be like the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford? Could it actually have been a slave quarters? So we reached out to the Boston Landmarks Commission and said, we really think that this house shouldn't be torn down, partly because it's not a good neighborhood for a building of 14 units, but also it has some real history to it, right? And it's a disservice to our community to not further investigate that. So, and the city was very much on board with this possibility and this need to research it. And fast forward a couple of years, what we discovered was, in fact, that it was not officially or explicitly a slave quarters, but that it was kind of something in between. It turns out to have been a stable building, and a stable would have been just a part and parcel of any of these country estates here in the 18th century. And in that stable, where Governor Shirley and later owners would have housed these really wonderful collections of very expensive, very fine horses, the men who cared for those horses, the grooms and stable boys, would have lived in the stables with the horses to care for them and to train them and to, keep them fed and protect them. And so that does open up a dimension of the life of enslaved men in New England that has not been really sort of studied or fleshed out before. So, knowing that little bit of the story, we sought funding from the city of Boston to actually purchased the property because its story is so integral to, you know, the story of empire and the British Empire and Governor Shirley's reign and then the lives of the people who, you know, have built Boston, right?
Mhm. Well, this is a wonderful overview of the site.
Yeah.
And as we move on, what are we seeing here?
So these are the investigations that some of our preservation architects, or this is the results of the investigations that they took when we sort of, you know, were first able to get into the building. And really poking around in corners and looking at framing, we discovered that the pink area that you see is the sort of part of the building that remains today. And if you look at the numbers running along the lower edge of that rectangle, what we discovered was that the rafters in the attic were numbered 6 through 11, which we knew meant that rafters 1 through 5 were missing, and that indicated that the building had been cut in half at some point. And when you get a long, low building like that, that tells you that it's a stable, a place where you can house horses all in a row, right? And then another sort of curious thing was discovering this plaster and lath inside the building, which spoke to the fact that the building wasn't a barn as it had really originally been thought of, but that it was something sort of more fancier than a barn, right? In a barn, you just carry cattle and pigs and, you know, you're not going to make anything nice out of it. But a stable was very much a place for showcasing these fabulous animals for these wealthy folks. And they frequently plastered parts of it. They had fine woodwork. You know, not only did you want to show off your horses, but you wanted to show off the architecture of the stable itself, just like you would show off your big house, right? And then this photo that you see here, this wonderful image of some of the framing, is actually up in the attic. And that wouldn't have been a fancier part of the building. That would have been left unframed. And a really wonderful piece of evidence that we discovered of sort of people being in the building are these black marks that you see on this vertical support stud. Those black marks are actually the result of burning rushlights, right? You know, late at night, you take a rushlight and you stick it in a little ball of clay onto the wood there. And as the rushlight burns down, as it gets close to the wood, it makes those little sort of burn marks in the wood. And those really tell us that somebody, some servant or enslaved person is, you know, burning the midnight oil in the house, right? Probably unknown to the members of the family. Who knows, right? Enjoying a quiet meal, maybe learning to read, you know, something that is happening in the building that is, you know, in a space that is secluded and private, and it's absolutely sort of so evocative and telling of the lives of the people who
Most definitely.
worked.
And here we see some of the excavation investigation that was on.
Right. And what you see in this pit here is a really wonderful cobblestone drive in absolutely pristine condition that, you know, Shirley's coachman and footman would have brought his coaches up, or and visitors would have brought their coaches up along this cobblestone drive in those days. It speaks to how well it was built.
And this was a wonderful discovery.
Yeah, so the archaeology was done in the fall of 2022 by Joe Bagley's team in the city archaeology office. And they actually ended up spending much longer here than they had originally anticipated because it was such an intriguing site. And one of the things that came up was this cowrie shell. And cowrie shells in Boston are only found in sites that are associated with enslavement. And they actually originate in East Africa, and they're used as a trade device and also a communication device, or they were in Africa in the you know, medieval times and through the 18th century. And so the fact that this emerged from the ground there was another little sort of physical, tangible evidence of the lives of enslaved people on our site.
You know, before we hear from SidMarie and the stones that she created to memorialize the individuals we're about to hear about, fortunate you provided us with a short video that gives a little background information about the individuals. As we're rolling it, feel free to add some commentary, Suzy, about what was learned and how this information was assembled, please.
Oh, sure. So in 2020, as we were beginning to sort of think about how we rescue the building from demolition, we hired a Harvard graduate student to really flesh out the research on the enslaved people at Shirley Place. And he actually discovered many more people than we originally knew about. The first person that he discovered was Jack, who was purchased by Shirley almost immediately after he arrives in Boston. And then we know about Jack because he runs away at some point. And then Jane is the next person that we learned about, and she is baptized in the Shirley household in the 1740s, and we think she remains with the household for many years. And Nanny's story is really poignant. She's a baby who is given to Shirley's youngest daughter as a gift, which was common in those days. And Nanny dies shortly thereafter. Thomas Scipio is Shirley's manservant, and he's with Shirley for many, many years. The two men actually grow old together. And then the two Caesars and Affy end up, one of the Caesars is a child of Jane, and Affy is a child of Jane. And then the other Caesar we think is the father of these. And this wonderful banner that we have was made for us. And actually, SidMarie, you may have done the design work on that banner. Vanya Arroyo, SidMarie's sister, when she organized the first Juneteenth year, had the banner created for us. And so it gets displayed. It's actually on permanent display, but when we do our Juneteenth festivals, we bring it outside for the most people to look at it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for all that background information. And moving on, SidMarie, would you share, how did you become involved with this project that led to these wonderful stones that you've designed?
So just as Suzy was mentioning, my sister, Vanya, she is very involved in different parts of like the social scene of the city. And she, during the summer that this kind of came about, she started to blog. She travels a lot. And so she would go to different places and people would find out that she's from Boston. And, she's darker skinned than me. And she would, people would be like, wow, there are Black people in Boston. So she started this whole blog just trying to showcase all the different rich history in Boston culturally. And so she went to the Shirley House in order to talk with them about this Juneteenth event that she wanted to host in Roxbury. And she thought it would be a great idea to host it at a historical site. And so that's how they connected. And so they were talking about possibly a memorialization project. And my sister just mentioned me that I was a painter, that I was an artist, and she just plugged me in. I had happened to be working with youth at that time, and I was doing rock painting projects with them. And so my sister just floated the idea, but we were using very small, smoothed over stones for that project. And so this, that's kind of where the idea was born. And then we decided to look all over the property to see if we could find stones that we could use as sort of a canvas, and as well as memorials.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then once you procured the stones, what went into the design and your choice of what was going to be featured on each one?
So because I was working full-time at the youth program down the street, right on Shirley Street, I would take some of my time on my lunch break and walk up to the property, walk around the property, and just kind of sit there and sort of take the space in. And I noticed just the abundance of birds. I had recently became interested in birding, just like looking from my house, from my porch in Dorchester. And so I had learned a little bit about the different birds that you could see. And I was able to recognize first one that I saw the most on the property was the American robin. And they just have a very, sort of dignified way of walking around on the grounds and stuff like that. And that's sort of how the idea started. So I spoke to Suzy, who also loves birds, and we just thought that it would be a good idea just because birds represent, just freedom and transcendence. And then the fact that there are so many different types and so many different colors. And I love color. So I thought it would be a good idea to use the motif of birds, specifically birds that we see on the property now and could have been around at the time when these people lived there. to represent some of them, especially because we didn't have a lot of information about each of the enslaved people, formerly enslaved people. We just really mostly there, as you could see, like their names and their ages and stuff like that. And so a lot of it was sort of just kind of feeling it out and taking some creative liberty, I guess, and making those decisions.
What went into the placement of the stones around the property?
It was kind of the same way I arrived at like picking out the different stones. Me, Rachel, and Suzy walked around the property, and we just talked about the different people and where they might have spent some of their time. For example, Affy, the little girl, we thought she might have wanted at least to spend time around the garden. And so I colored her stone, you know, with colors that you might see in a garden, put a small beautiful bird on her stone, and we decided to place her stone by the garden. And so it was a lot of that, sort of walking around and figuring out where they might have spent their time and what they might have been looking at, and then choosing colors and birds that complemented each other and that sort of bit of their story.
How about Jane? What went into her stone?
So Jane Stone has a female American goldfinch, set to like some blues and greens. And we see it was what Suzy was saying was because we know that she was a little girl and she was baptized, but then not much is said in the historical record, but they have some ideas that she probably spent a lot of time there and grew up there. And the American goldfinch is just such a striking bird. And so I decided to put a female there just to, I guess, to give some honor to the fact that she had grown up and she had gotten to live some bit of her life, as opposed to, you know, what we hear about some of the other stories where, you know, they were babies when they passed away. And Suzy and Rachel sort of explained that she might have spent more of her time around the kitchen area. And so this stone is placed somewhere near where she might have spent most of her time.
And Rachel being Rachel Hoyle, the program director.
Yes.
And there's the Affy stone that you mentioned. And as we see with all of the explanations, very helpful QR codes to learn more about the project as well as yourself. A terrific feature to have there.
Absolutely.
That was very much Rachel's contribution to the project, was to sort of curate the stones and to make sure that SidMarie's biography and sort of point of view was represented in this project.
Wonderful. SidMarie, word about William, please, and his stone.
So this was actually one of my favorite stones. William, as we could see, was most likely worked closely to a carpenter, Benjamin Eustace. And so the bird that I used, you know, brown and earth tones to represent some of that. And then the bird that we put on his stone is a downy woodpecker. And just, you know, for the obvious connection to wood and just the colors too, the color of the bird, the way that it looks, the small orange patch on it, just complemented the colors on the stones. Because what I would do is take the stones, come up with a color scheme, a color palette for each stone, and then I would go back and decide which bird went on which stone and which color. So the decisions sort of layered on top of each other. And William Stone, to me, I just loved it. I loved how it came out.
No, the balance of the colors really make them so exquisite. And final person we'll hear about Caesar.
So Caesar, I believe this is the adult, possibly the father Caesar. And on his stone, this was a cobblestone, which was painted with like an iridescent, like pearl color in the background, I wanted to keep it looking like a cobblestone, but obviously a little bit more brighter. I had to clean it, and then the pearl kind of gives it a bit of a shine in the sunlight. And I put a cardinal on his stone just because of the presence of the cardinal. Like when you see it, it's very striking. It's an all red bird. The males, the females as well, but the males are just like, they have that, the black on their face is just, it makes them stand out as sort of like regal and almost, it's beautiful, but almost there's a strength there. And so I decided to put the cardinal and the color and the patch of gold around Caesar's name to try to an attempt to honor him as a man and as a maybe a leader to his family as much as he could have been at that time.
Terrific, terrific. You know, looking back, what's one thing, I know there are many, but what's one thing that stood out from you from being involved with this initiative?
I would say I was thinking about this on my drive this morning, and I guess what stood out to me is just the simplicity of, not knowing a lot about what their interests were, or what their dreams might have been, or what their interactions with their other family members and things like that. We don't get the privilege of knowing all those details, but we get to know their name, where they lived, and at least maybe how long they may have lived. And just that little bit of information, very simple amount of information, is still plenty to memorialize someone with. And that was striking to me. And when I first started the project, I was kind of worried about that. I just thought I don't have enough information to really do this, and I wanted to give it a real effort, real shot. This is the most important thing I've done in my short time being an artist, and I realized with this project that that simplicity of information is still plenty, because um, just being able to remember that a person lived and died and were known by other people, even if we don't know much about them, is still pretty powerful, and it's important.
Most definitely. Well, you, Rachel, Suzy, took the information that was gleaned and have developed it into a wonderful memorial and just learning project. Because I know, Suzy, going forward, there's many upcoming tours, visitors, and building on this uh, exhibitions in the future about this and the project across the street. So there's lots to look forward to. And the minute we have left, Suzy, we're going to see an example of one of the activities from Juneteenth that took place that you referred to, just what people can look forward to or how people can find out more and keep in touch about the Shirley-Eustis House, please.
Oh, sure. So, well, you can always look us up on our website. It's just shirleyeusticehouse.org. The slide that you see here is a really wonderful dance troupe that performed at our first Juneteenth festival. And what was exciting about it was we had this audience sitting in these chairs, kind of expectantly waiting, and this troupe came up in this
Wow.
barrage of noise from the back of the audience, and then did this really wonderful dramatic dance with a musical accompaniment, and it had everybody mesmerized. It was just a great way to wrap up that day. And so Juneteenth especially is a sort of a multi-dimensional project. We have a barbecue, we have music, we have a black market, dancing, DJs, tours of the house, and artistic participation from folks like SidMarie. So it's a really fun kind of a community festival type event.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you both again for being here, for sharing the history, the project. And congratulations for outstanding effort and continued success with future endeavors.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. And we want to thank SidMarie again, because her project has really brought our site to life.
Most
Thank you.
definitely.
It's been an honor.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.